Welcome back, everyone. This is day 4 of social psych and also your first video lecture of the term. So a little bit of housekeeping before we go in. What this will look like is pretty similar to our normal lecture, but obviously it's videoed instead. So you'll have access to this video all day. Throughout the lecture, there will be some points where I'll ask you to answer questions. While you're answering or while you're following the lecture, I would just recommend having like your Google Doc or your Word document open so that you can take your notes, because at the end of the lecture, you will submit a copy of your video notes, which would be the questions that you answer, and you will also take your daily quiz. And I'll remind you guys of these things at the end, but that's just to get you ready. Today, we are continuing to talk about social cognition, which we started yesterday. A couple of reminders. Your first application assignment is going to be due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Make sure that that is a Google Doc or a Word document. Nothing else will be accepted or graded. And then your midterm is going to be due July 19th, but we'll talk about that. We'll have a review and a study guide for that as well. First thing that we learned yesterday was how important perception is, and we use this example. Inferences of competence from faces predict election outcomes, and we kind of talked about how elections are driven by automatic thinking. Actor-observer difference. You screw up because you're stupid. I screw up because it's out of my control, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. So that was an example of actor-observer difference. And then self-serving attributional bias. Things are good because I'm good, or things are bad because it's out of my control. Schemas are the structures that we as people use to organize knowledge in the world around us, and they're useful. Without them, you'd go to the library and have to read library etiquette every single time. You'd go to a football game and have to read stadium etiquette every single time. Because we have schemas, we're able to categorize things, and that helps us move through life. We looked at chronic and recent schema activation. So with our first example from our first day of class, this text from Katie, knowing that it could mean different things, right? Then we looked at recent schema activation. So in this example, we see this guy saying, blah, 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 blah. And here, our little man in the window is looking at an alcoholic. And then when he hears this man, he assumes that he's an alcoholic. Or same thing down here, reading a book about a mental patient and then seeing our guy in the middle and assuming that he is a mental patient. So we talked about how those things work in our life as well. So now is the time for your first video notes question. So make sure that you are typing the answer to this into your document. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Samuel, and then I will ask you the question that you are answering. So Samuel is very quiet and extremely smart. He loves to write computer code and solve problems. Samuel is also skinny, pale, and wears glasses. Is Samuel most likely a fraternity brother or a tech CEO, and why? So make sure that you answer that question based on the characteristics that I told you about Samuel. Is he most likely a fraternity brother or a tech CEO? That will be question 1 on your document. The first type of thinking we're going to talk about is automatic. That's thinking that's non-conscious, it's unintentional, involuntary, or effortless. So heuristics is a term that you've seen before, so we're going to use it again here. But using heuristics is a form of automatic thinking. So a representative heuristic would be classifying something based on how similar it is to a typical case. He sounds like a typical computer guy. He sounds like a typical tech guy. We're talking about Samuel based on the qualities that I gave you. When you're engaged in controlled thinking, though, you're aware that you're thinking. So this is thinking that is conscious, intentional, voluntary, and effortful. When you're engaging in controlled thinking, you're aware that you're thinking, and this requires mental energy. No matter what you like to tell yourself, mental energy can only go to one place at one time. Taking base rates into account is an example of controlled thinking. Mentally calculating the number of tech CEOs and making a more reasonable judgment. So when we stop and think and controlled thinking comes into play, along with using heuristics through correction. First, we might rely on automatic thinking and the representative heuristic, and then you might correct yourself using controlled thinking. So, for example, we might say, even though it feels like Samuel was more likely to be a tech CEO based on computer code and skinny and glasses and extremely smart, he's more likely to be a fraternity member because of the base rates, because there are more fraternity brothers than there are tech CEOs. Another example, imagine that you're walking across campus and you see this man looking disheveled. So what kind of person is this? If you use automatic thinking, you might apply the representative heuristic and think he looks like the typical homeless person. Or you might similarly use your schema of a homeless person to think that this guy fits right into that category. But if you think about where you are on a college campus and take into account the base rates of homeless people and professors on college campuses, he's more likely to be a professor than homeless. But in fact, this man is a professor, computer science at a school in California. So what factors could lead someone to correction? Two things, motivation and cognitive load. So the first one, will I have to be accountable for anything? Two is cognitive load. Am I tired? Am I in a hurry? I told you guys that you can only really focus on one thing at a time. So if I think I will have to be accountable, meaning that I'll have to explain or justify my interpretation to others, they're more likely to use controlled thinking and make a correction. If I'm tired, in a hurry, if I'm under that kind of cognitive load, I don't have the luxury of taking my time and energy to think carefully. I'm less likely to correct, and I am less likely to add in controlled thinking. I'm more likely to just keep going. So in general, I'm more likely to correct and use controlled thinking when I have high motivation and low cognitive load. So that tells us something. When you're taking an exam, to avoid the trick questions, you need to be motivated, be well rested, not rushed. And that allows you to think carefully and not just choose the answer that sounds best for some automatic or heuristic reason. So this same idea of automatic thinking and correction is true for person to person, or in this case, perception of this cat. If we use automatic thinking, we might just think, okay, he looks grumpy, so he's a grumpy cat, making this sort of an internal attribution. We can also engage in correction to prevent the fundamental attribution error. We only need to make the correction when we're under high motivation, but we can only make the correction when we have high motivation and we aren't under cognitive load. Then we might consider the situation, or we might use Kelly's model to think about whether other cats look grumpy right now, whether this cat is grumpy in other situations, and whether this cat is usually grumpy in this situation. So more mistakes that we use in social cognition, even though we think we're rational, fair, and careful, we often make a lot of mistakes and don't even recognize it. So I'll be going over some of these as well. Pluralistic ignorance is confusingly defined, but what we say is that no one understands, but everyone thinks everyone else understands. Another definition is the tendency to act in ways that conflict with your true preferences because you mistakenly think that your preferences are different from others. Pluralistic ignorance comes up a lot in a bar. Maybe you don't like to drink or you don't feel like it tonight, but everyone around you is drinking, so you keep drinking. On your walk home, someone starts complaining they didn't even feel like going to the bar tonight, and everyone else chimes in. Turns out no one wanted to be drinking, but everyone just assumed that the others wanted to. That's an example of pluralistic ignorance. Two other examples. I say something confusing and it doesn't make sense to you. This could happen in our class. This might have happened already. You want to raise your hand, but no one else does, so you let it go. Turns out that no one understood what I was saying, and no one wanted to hold their hand up, so they just let it go. Or maybe SU has a policy that everyone thinks is stupid, but no one talks about it because everyone assumes that since it's policy, people must be okay with it. Question 2 for your video notes is to give another example of pluralistic ignorance, or something everyone pretends to believe. So write this in at least 2 to 3 sentences, and this is video notes question number 2. Next is self-fulfilling prophecy, behaving in ways that elicit the behavior that we are expecting from others. So fulfilling this prophecy that I am saying. Imagine you hate having to order food and drinks at the bar. It's crowded and you have to wait around and you're jostling with other people. And you find bartenders annoying because they never have any time for you and they're always shouting. So you show up to the bar one day and the bartender walks over and you're like, finally, some service. So you order and they snap back at you because they're busy and walk away. And now you're like, yep, bartenders suck and they have no patience for the customer. This is related to schemas because my schema of a bartender might be that they are impatient and slow. So I behaved in accordance to what I was expecting. And then I elicited that behavior. So this is problematic because I just received more evidence for my schema, but it was wrong in the first place. Another example of this self-fulfilling prophecy showing that ultimately you are the one that is confirming your expectancy. So you have an expectancy or a social theory about the target person. This guy over here is just saying he's a snob and the other is saying what a nice day. Then in step 2, you're saying I'm just not going to say hello. You behave toward the target in a way that's consistent with your theory or expectation, but the target is like, what the heck? So in 3, the target responds to your behavior in the same manner. Well, he didn't say hello to me. What a jerk. I won't say hello either. In 4, you see the target's behavior as proof that your expectancy was right. You don't realize the role that you played in the target's response. This also works similarly with this cycle of loneliness. So accidentally confirming expectations of being rejected. And one response to feeling disconnected is to isolate yourself even further, which leads to you accidentally confirming your expectation that you are being rejected. So if I perceive that I'm isolated, I feel lonely. And then I might become so vigilant to any signs of being rejected. So if someone walks by me and they don't wave, I might over-perceive that as rejecting and remember it more. And so if I keep walking and now I put in my headphones, I put my hood up and I scowl, I'm eliciting rejection. That's what I want now because that's what I'm expecting. No one wants to say hi because I look like I'm gonna punch them. But one unfortunate reaction to disconnection is, again, further isolation and loneliness. Confirmation bias is selectively seeking information that will confirm something that you already believe. Very similar to self-fulfilling prophecy, but now you're not bringing about the outcome through your behavior. You are looking for information to already confirm your belief. And what that's ultimately doing is biasing the information that you're processing. So once you've made a judgment, even a crazy one, you're more likely to seek out information that's consistent with your belief. In regards to person perception, once you have an impression of someone, you continue to try to find information to confirm that perception that you formed. So for example, if you ask what are the benefits of vegetarianism and I'm looking for benefits, what is AI going to show you? It's going to show you benefits. But if you ask the opposite question and say what are the risks of vegetarianism, it's going to show you obviously the risk. So you could look up different things to confirm things that you already know or already feel. Confirmation bias also plays a role in where people choose to get their news. Fox News is considered a more conservative or right-leaning news source, and its audience composition skews to the right. A few consistently liberal and few mostly liberal people, but many more who are consistently conservative. People get news from sources that they agree with beliefs they already have. So if I like Trump or DeSantis, etc., I might seek out more information from sources that post about them. We see the opposite when we look at CNN, a left-leaning news source, more liberal spin on the news. People who are consistently conservative are not getting their news from CNN. If I like Biden, I'm going to watch sources that make me like him even more. So for example, Michael likes Ryan, therefore he's always looking for the best in him, even when he really screws up. The next thing that we're going to talk about is framing. So that is the way the information is presented to us impacts how we understand it. Another mistake we make when we are interpreting situations has to do with framing. And we understand differently based on how information is presented rather than the actual relevant information. So 20% off versus 80% on. Another example of this, the odds of survival 1 month after surgery are 90% versus the odds of mortality within 1 month of surgery is 10%. So we're saying the same things, but the ways that they are framed, the verbiage that we are using, makes you as the perceiver feel differently. Video question number 3 is, what's another framing effect you see in everyday life? So on your document, you'll do number 3. And what's another framing effect you see in everyday life? So first thing that we learned in this class was this formula. And this slide shows, again, that famous idea that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. But here's the twist that we are talking about. It's not the environment itself that drives the behavior. It's how the person interprets the environment or how it is construed. So this is what we know. Now, what shapes that interpretation? One powerful influence is the primacy effect, or the tendency to give extra weight to the first information that we get. That means our first impressions can steer how we make sense of everything that comes after that. So ideally, people would act based on accurate understandings of the situation. That's the hopefully in parentheses. But in reality, early information can bias how we see the situation, and that bias shapes our behavior. Imagine you are at a talent show and you are one of the judges. You've seen 5 performers, the first few were great, but now you've just watched the last one, and that performance is the one that's stuck in your head. So when it's time to choose a winner, who do you think you'll lean towards? Probably the last one, right? Not because they were necessarily the best, but because their performance is the freshest in your memory. And that would be an example of the recency effect. Our minds give more weight to the most recent information we've seen or heard. It's kind of like how you might forget what someone said in the beginning of a conversation, but clearly remember their last comment. And recency can shape our impressions even when we're trying to be objective. Last mistake that we make in social cognition is related to these causal attributions. We want to believe that the world is fair and that the world is just and everything happens for a reason. So in other words, that people get what they deserve because the world is just. The mistake is that when we make attributions for why things happen, we often tend to attribute fault to the victims, or victim blaming the victim. This is another mistake that we can make when trying to understand situations, and it can be self-protective, but it can also lead to inaccurate conclusions. And sometimes these things are true, right? Ideally, when I give you an exam, the exam is fair. So the grade that you get on the exam would be the grade that you deserve. But sometimes this isn't true. So when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and people were injured and killed, we said, well, that happened because people didn't evacuate. They just decided not to evacuate, so it's their own fault. They deserve to have that suffering because they didn't evacuate. This same kind of belief in a just world thinking happens when there is a sexual assault. One of the first questions people might ask when someone is sexually assaulted is, was he or she drunk? Then it's their own fault, right? If they were. When someone gets mugged, we ask, were they out late at night? We blame the victim, assuming it's their own fault and that they got what they deserve because it makes us feel better, because we think it couldn't happen to us. And this kind of thinking is, again, self-protective, but it is a defensive attribution because it allows for us to believe that something devastating couldn't happen to us. I would have evacuated, so that couldn't have been me, or I wouldn't have been walking alone or drunk or whatever else. But we're ignoring the situation. Sometimes the world just isn't fair and the world is just not just. So congratulations on finishing the topics and the contents from week 1. We're now going to review some of these things that we learned, but using SpongeBob, okay? On your video notes worksheet, you should have questions 1 through 3 from the lecture. And now you can either skip and create a new section for review. So our first question in our first scenario is that suppose SpongeBob and Patrick hear screechy noises from Squidward's house. So this is practicing our formula that we learned. What we know about Squidward is that he's serious, refined, and enjoys classical music, and that Squidward was raised by parents who enjoyed music and went to art school. So based on what we know about Squidward and his environment, what can we assume that Squidward is doing? That is review question number 1. Based on what we know about Squidward, he must be practicing his clarinet. If Patrick is taking a long time to read the menu at the Krusty Krab, and Squidward's response is he's an idiot, but SpongeBob says, well, the menu is so big, it takes a long time to make up your mind. What is this an example of? The fact that it's a really big menu and Patrick is still reading. Is it 1, the actor-observer difference, 2, self-serving attributional bias, or 3, fundamental attribution error? This is review question number 2. Review question number 3. Sandy wants to know the relationship between watering a plant with seawater versus fresh water. She can answer this question in 3 ways. What are the 3 ways that Sandy could answer this question, and how could she do that? So first, what we know about cross-sectional correlations. Sandy could correlate the amount of water added to plants around her dome with plant height, and this would tell her if salt water added to plants is associated with plant height. She could do a longitudinal correlation and take stocks of all the heights in January, in March. She can add salt water to each, and then later in July, and she could record the heights again. This would tell her if over time salt water added to plants is associated with plant water or plant height. And then third, she could do an experiment. She might have SpongeBob randomly give salt water to some plants and none to others. A month later, she will assess their heights. Her IV, her independent variable, would be the amount of salt water given to the plants. And the dependent variable is the plant height. And this would tell her whether adding salt water to plants causes change in height. Review question number 4 and scenario number 4. Mr. Krabs walks into his office on Monday morning and sees his safe is empty. Immediately he thinks Plankton must have done this. But then after thinking about it, Mr. Krabs thinks there might be another reason the formula is missing. Turns out SpongeBob was dusting the safe and moved it. Question 4, which types of thinking did Mr. Krabs engage with just then? When he immediately thought Plankton, and then when he thought about it for a while and realized that it may have been moved. Immediately thinking Plankton would be automatic thinking, and then thinking about it for a while and adjusting would be controlled thinking. So that's all for your review questions. Just a couple of more scenarios or examples of the things that we covered this past week. When profits are up, Mr. Krabs tells shareholders it's because he's a great boss. But when they're down, he blames the supply chain. And Plankton points out that this is an example of self-serving attributional bias. You know from watching SpongeBob that fish tend to be laid back and passive, whereas the only Plankton character is cunning and evil. If someone described a specific ocean creature as relaxed, quiet, but not going to bother anyone, you might think it's a fish. But according to base rate information, there are far more plankton in the sea than fish, making it more likely that this creature that is chill and relaxed and not going to bother anyone is a fish. All right, you guys, that is a wrap on week 1. Reminder that your application assignment is due this upcoming Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Make sure that you only submit a Word document or a PDF. No pages, no links, no anything else, only those 2 things. And then a preview into week 2's topic. So we're going to talk about the implications of social cognition. We were introduced to them today and yesterday. We're going to talk about so what, who cares in regards to them. We'll do emotions and aggression, and then we'll talk about self-concepts and self-esteem. Your midterm is going to open to you on July 16th, but we'll have review and study guides before all of that happens. Make sure that you take your July 2nd quiz. Here is the access code. Take your July 2nd quiz and submit a PDF or a Word document copy of your answered video note questions. You have until 11:59 to submit both the video notes as well as your quiz for the day. Have a good weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday.